Half of the American population is struggling to find affordable housing. A recent Harvard report found that housing is now unaffordable for a record half of U.S. renters.
My rent just skyrocketed and I can't afford it, so I have less than 30 days to move, and everybody else is asking for two to three times the rent. 2 to 3 times, I can't even speak. Who the makes that? Like, we can't afford to live. But who said this was the dream? Because this is a nightmare.
Listen to me. I will never be able to afford a house. I will never be able to afford a house.
I don't think any of us thought when we were growing up that owning a home would be a luxury. Like, maybe we thought it would be a bit difficult, but not like a luxury that basically only the rich will be able to afford.
No one that works a full-time job should be facing homelessness. And that's what my family is facing right now.
Being completely radicalized by the rental housing market right now, I cannot believe that you can pay over $300 in non-refundable fees just to apply for an apartment.
A big part of the reason why social life here in America is getting more and more difficult has to do with the fact that nobody can afford decent housing.
Everybody in America kind of knows, like, it's over. Like, there will be no recovery. Like, this is not like the other times. This ain't like 2008 where, oh, we'll crash and then we'll get back up.
Because right now, this economy, this world is set up to make average American families fail.
If I can get my hands on a nice lump sum of money, baby, I'm buying land in another country and I'm out of here because there's nothing left here but struggle.
99% of people in America cannot afford to purchase a home. So people are left to the rental market, which is now in disarray, with soaring rents and limited options, and it's leaving many people unable to find a place to call home. But what's driving the rental crisis? Why are so many Americans being priced out of rental housing? It's not because they're blowing their money on avocado toast and caramel macchiatos. It's because unchecked corporate greed has made it increasingly difficult for Americans to survive. A new Harvard report says that a record half of U.S. renters pay more than 30% of their income for rent and utilities, and nearly half of those people were severely cost-burdened, paying more than 50% of their income. Renters earning $30,000 to $74,999 saw the sharpest rise in cost burden since 2019. The federal government defines rent burden as paying more than 30% of your income towards rent. And a record number of Americans, 653,100, were homeless on a given night in January of 2023. This is the highest number of homeless people ever recorded since 2007. One of the primary reasons why people can't afford housing is income inequality. Housing prices are going up, but incomes are not keeping up with it. Here's a great reel that illustrates how income isn't keeping up with the cost of living using data from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Since 1985, rent growth has exceeded inflation by 40%, while income has only grown by 7%. And in the last 2 decades, income has continued to not keep up with rent growth.
You can't afford to buy a house, but you likely can't afford rent either. In today's dystopian reality, half of all U.S. renters can't afford housing. Why?
The rent is too damn high.
But I'm making more. Why can't I keep up? Rent hikes have dramatically outpaced income hikes. While rent has gone up 21% over the last 2 decades, income has only gone up 2%. Tack that on to our rising debt, the paycheck to paycheck lifestyle like it's a choice, and the upper class income required for a middle class life, and well, it's no wonder therapy's so popular. And alcoholism.
The New York Times interviewed renters across the country who are struggling to make ends meet, and here's what they said. Will this ever end? Will it get any better? Can I get out of this? Said Alex LaRaza, who said he pays 49% of his $55,000 annual salary towards rent and utilities for a duplex in North Kingstown, Rhode Island. It's gotten so bad. Should I eat or should I worry about the heat getting turned off? He said that he's behind on his utility bills and he's abandoned any hobbies that cost money, and sometimes he even skips meals. He says, I'll make my daughter lunch, feed her dinner, and I'll just not eat. And a Manhattan woman who works at a healthcare technology company said that she spends 44% of her $64,350 salary on rent and utilities in a 2-bedroom apartment that she shares with a roommate on the Upper East Side. The stress takes on an emotional toll, she says. There are days where I just can't get out of bed. See, the trap is that people people often have to move to these larger cities in order to find more work opportunities, but in these larger cities, the cost of living is so high. More and more, we're seeing that people are working longer hours and they're being paid less and less. I mean, it's bad enough that you have to work these jobs that make people feel so miserable, but to not even have anything to show for it, to still be struggling with your rent, to still be struggling to make ends meet, to still be struggling to put food on the table, that's sad. The reason that people can't find affordable housing isn't because the housing itself doesn't exist, it's that the affordable housing doesn't exist. Let me explain. Luxury housing is often prioritized by these corporate landlords, right? Because that's what brings in the big bucks. Because housing is ran on such a capitalistic, profit-driven model, more and more landlords, namely corporate landlords as well as real estate developers, are not prioritizing building out affordable housing because that's just not what's going to drive their numbers and drive their profit margins. According to Moody's Analytics data, in the last 2 decades, the share of construction for high-priced apartments known as Class A apartments grew faster than affordable ones. In fact, they say over half, 51% of 2022 rental construction projects were luxury apartments. Data from Mansion Global shows that billions of dollars were spent in 2023 to build luxury apartments that were meant to attract wealthy people. Half of the apartments in another area of housing for the richest of the world, known as Billionaires Row, also remain empty, in part because many of these houses are purchased by wealthy oligarchs from abroad to hide their wealth by setting up anonymous shell companies, and also because the ultra-rich hoard houses that they rarely stay in, well, just because they can. It's disillusioning to think that the majority of housing that gets built is luxury housing when the vast majority of Americans can't afford that. There are actual houses just sitting there empty, all in the name of wealth hoarding and overconsumption. In Detroit, there are more vacant homes per homeless individual than anywhere else in the country, with 116 empty houses per each unhoused person. United Way says that there are currently 28 vacant homes for every one person that experiences homelessness in the United States. Powerful corporate landlords and real estate developers also exert an excessive amount of influence on housing policies through lobbying and campaign contributions. Corporate politicians are being influenced by generous donations from real estate developers, and they often prioritize the interests of the wealthy over the interests of the general public who are struggling to find affordable housing. So as a result, their policies tend to favor deregulation and market-driven approaches. Take Governor Kathy Hochul of New York, for example. In the first 5 months after she became acting governor, she received $21.6 million in contributions, much of which came from real estate executives and developers. An anti-money laundering bill that was meant to crack down on anonymous real estate shell companies was watered down through changes that Kathy Hochul made after she received millions of dollars in campaign financing from real estate donors. And Vote St. PAC, who's a top contributor to dozens of senators and representatives, funnels contributions from individuals nearly exclusively from the real estate industry. According to the Center for Responsive Politics, Vote Saint's contributions went disproportionately to members serving on the congressional committees with the primary jurisdiction over housing and finance issues. Representative Richard Neal of Massachusetts received $92,750 from Vote St. PAC in the 2018 election cycle. Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina received $138,000 from Vote St. PAC in the 2018 election cycle. Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio received $118,526 from Vote St. PAC in the 2018 election. Senator Johnny Isakson of Georgia received $181,700 from Vote St. in 2016. And in the 2022 election cycle, Senators Tim Scott, Marco Rubio, John Thune, and many more received hefty donations from Vote St. PAC. And for the past several years, the National Association of Realtors has also been one of the top 2 highest spending groups on federal lobbying. The National Association of Realtors and its affiliates work actively to work against measures aimed at improving housing affordability and stability for renters, actively lobbying against rent stabilization and rent control measures. In the first 3 quarters of 2022, they spent $56.2 million on lobbying, according to records from the Senate. And so as we talked about in our video on how Americans are uneducated, and that's by design, these politicians aren't enacting laws that are in the best interest of the American public. Again, they are beholden to these lobbying groups. Corporate landlords have also been accused of using software to inflate the rent prices of their tenants.
A group of large landlords is now being sued for their approach to business. The lawsuits focus on their agreements with RealPage, a major provider of property management software.
Effectively, RealPage is facilitating a housing cartel.
RealPage products are used to set prices on roughly 4.5 million housing units in the United States. That includes the units in this complex, some of which had rents starting at just under $3,000 a month in January 2024.
We've been told as tenants by employees of Equity that the software takes empathy out of the equation, so they can charge whatever the software tells them to charge.
And corporate landlords are also buying up properties, namely single-family homes, across the country. According to MetLife Investment Management, institutional investors may control 40% of U.S. single-family rental homes by 2030. Since the early 2010s, Tricon Residential, Progress Residential, American Homes for Rent, and Invitation Homes have each bought thousands of homes, and these are all corporate landlord companies. Private equity firms like Blackstone are also buying up properties across the country and raising rents. Gladys Balcazar in Imperial Beach, California, is a single mom living with her son who has a disability, and she told California Matters that she spends 83% of her income toward rent. She makes just $2,800 a month. Blackstone bought her building and 65 others in San Diego County in 2021, and her building is filled with large swaths of dark mold outside of the building, on the walls, window ledges, on the roof line, and a building manager said that she would be responsible for the mold remediation in her unit if she moves out. Last March, her monthly rent rose by $1,800 after Blackstone purchased it. Other properties that Blackstone purchased across San Diego County saw anywhere from a 50% increase to an over 200% increase in rent. These corporate landlords and private equity firms are a huge reason that you're seeing rents skyrocket across the country. The lack of affordable housing is, of course, a significant contributing factor on homelessness. A lot of people have this very myopic, classist attitude towards homelessness. They believe that it's a moral choice and they squandered their lives away, and that's how they ended up in the streets. The lack of affordable housing, coupled with this social stratification that is facilitated by capitalism, is the cause of homelessness, is the cause of poverty. While people might engage in substance abuse as a result of poverty, the cause is the social conditions that made them want to use in the first place. It can happen to literally anybody. It's not as simple as go get a job at McDonald's. It's not that simple. Many homeless people are mentally ill, physically disabled, and unable to work. And there's many people who work full-time jobs and still can't afford to get their own houses and are homeless as a result.
Just got declined for another place and no one's letting me rent. And then yet people want to complain about homeless people. But homeless people be out here having whole full jobs and nobody be wanting to rent to them because they're homeless. I feel like this big right now.
And then the other argument that people make is just go to a homeless shelter. Homeless shelters are often overcrowded, dangerous, and they also impose limits on how long people can stay there. Shelters are absolutely not a solution to homelessness. Take New York City shelters, where it's been reported that they have cockroaches in their food and mice crawling around in the beds. It's just not a pretty picture. It's not a place that anybody would want to stay.
There are a lot of reasons why someone would prefer to live on the street over a shelter. And I know that's hard for a lot of you to believe because, why would someone want to live on the street? When it comes to shelters, a lot of the funding is actually misplaced. The CEOs make themselves rich off of shelters. And if you don't believe me, just Google places like Jack Brown or Auburn Place in New York City. I stayed there. They make themselves rich off of homeless shelters and treat the residents like crap. Shelters can be very dehumanizing. They don't treat you like you're a person. They treat you like you're a number or a statistic or like you did something wrong. You're basically a prisoner just because you're houseless. And it's kind of f***ed up. Not to mention the fact that shelters require a lot of paperwork that can be hard to process or hard to get or even hard to pay for. For example, I didn't have a birth certificate or a social security card or an ID. I would not be able to get into a homeless shelter. And it's crazy because a lot of homeless people don't have this paperwork. And even if they did have the access to get the paperwork, they could not pay for it because it cost me money to get my birth certificate. Like, I only got it about 2 weeks ago because I got donations and was able to order a birth certificate and a social security card. And the process to get HRA or Medicaid insurance or anything like that in New York City can be difficult. It's something that's really hard to do for even me, never mind people who suffer from extreme mental illness or disability. And it's estimated that about 80% of homeless people suffer from a mental illness or disability. Not to mention the fact that a woman being homeless is extremely dangerous. Men as well, especially women though, are subjected to a lot of harassment or sexual assault in the homeless shelters on the streets by guards, CEOs, workers, staff, other residents, and people do nothing about it. Like, I actually even saw a guard say that no one would ever believe someone just because of the fact that they were homeless, and homeless people are often brushed off as crazy or their statements cannot be deemed reliable in court.
You have people like the demon mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, who are trying to criminalize homelessness. He's recently vetoed a number of bills that push to get people who are homeless into permanent housing. In New York City, where most rent is too expensive for the working class to even afford. A recent report found that a full half of New York City's households did not have enough money to comfortably hold down an apartment and access sufficient food and basic health care across the city. So yeah, homelessness is a choice, but it's a choice made by the government to actively not support people who need housing.
Nobody wants to admit this, but homelessness is a choice made by cities who want people to be homeless. I had you there, didn't I? People like to use the narrative that homelessness is purely caused by substance abuse and financial irresponsibility, which is meritocratic propaganda. A small citywide rent increase could and has unhoused thousands of renters, not to mention that countless people are literally just a medical bill away from being homeless. The only city-approved option for existing as a homeless person is to use homeless shelters, which are often overcrowded, turn people away, and don't always guarantee more than a night's stay. And if you are forced to camp, the city will likely flush away so much money to absolutely brutalize you for needing a place to sleep. Investing in criminalization and hostile architecture makes up over 3 times as much spending per person than just investing in reasonable housing alternatives. This is a choice for cities, and they choose to brutalize homeless people instead of providing housing.
And then of course we have the historical practices of things like redlining and gentrification that often pushes Black and Indigenous folks out of their housing and into poverty. The lack of affordable housing is yet another example of how corporate greed pushes people to the margins and impedes on the quality of life for the working class. The lack of affordable housing is a complex issue. It's multifaceted. But if we're not calling out the root causes of capitalism, of corporate greed, political corruption, and racial disparities, then we're not having a full conversation. We live in a world that is rigged to keep poor people poor and rich people rich. And the reality is that despite how some people like to pretend to be rich on social media, the vast majority of us, we're never going to get there. We're never going to be rich. It's best for the collective good for us to stand in solidarity with each other and take a stand against corporate greed. Addressing this crisis really requires a paradigm shift, a fundamental paradigm shift where we're moving away from viewing housing as a luxury and instead moving toward viewing housing as a right. Every single person deserves access to safe and affordable housing. And I always believe that awareness is the first step to solving the problem. Because if you're not aware of the root causes of the problem, how can you even begin to dismantle it? But I'd love to hear from you all in the comments down below. Are you struggling to afford housing? How are you making ends meet? If you like this video, definitely give it a thumbs up. And if you really liked it and you want more content like this, definitely hit that subscribe button, and I'll talk to you all next time.